I found another phone back there. If you don't want to keep the phone on the ground.
Oh, that's okay because we need to
Take
take
the lights from time to time.
right. It's because it's
Here.
yeah.
No, don't worry.
Yeah, is it good? Okay.
Okay, folks, let's go ahead and get started. People who've been around all day, please tell me how you did it when you get a chance. Thank you so much for coming to the first keynote lecture of the 2018 Society of Global Scholars Conference on Globalization, and the world is still possible. This evening, I have the signal honor of introducing Dr. Jackie Smith. Dr. Smith is a professor of sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as the editor of the Journal of World Systems Research. She is a leading scholar of transnational social movements, and her most recent books include Social Movements and World System Transformation, co-edited with Michael Goodhart, Patrick Manning, and John Markoff; Social Movements in the World System, The Politics of Crisis and Transformation, with Don West; and Global Democracy and the World Social Forums, with multiple collaborators. Dr. Smith's work on the World Social Forum process has led her to examine how global analyses and models of action are translated to local settings. Her participant observation research has included extensive work with Pittsburgh's Human Rights City Alliance. Without further ado, Dr. Jackie Smith.
I want to thank the conference organizers for all the hard work that you've done to assemble what's been a really excellent conference so far. I've really been learning a lot and getting a lot of energy from the folks who've presented so far. And I hope I can add and contribute more to that energy as we go forward. I'm just going to plug our journal because I'm going to get wrapped up in the other work that I'm going to present here. And I hope that you'll all note the URL here and submit your papers to our journal. It's open access, free to everybody in the world. Before I start, I also want to acknowledge and thank my fellow organizers whose knowledge and ideas I'm sharing with you tonight. As in all of our academic work, we often take individual authorship of our ideas, but they're really the results of a collective, collaborative process of knowledge building. And so I want to recognize that. And the folks that I've been working with most closely in recent years to draw out some of these lessons about liberatory movements, the World Social Forum process, and especially the US Social Forum organizers, and my comrades in the Human Rights City movement, Human Rights City Alliance in Pittsburgh and nationally. I've been working very closely and learning a great deal about how we take ideas and principles that are being articulated in global spaces and try to translate them into the day-to-day lives of everyday folks, and to expand engagement with a vision of how the world could be organized. So what I'm going to do tonight is maybe start with drawing out a few lessons and themes that are becoming more clear to me as I do more of this work and get more intensely involved in my identity as an activist. I'm finding that that identity is maybe displacing, but maybe becoming synced with my identity as a scholar as I either get older or get more experienced in this work. But as I'm doing work now with cities and locally based struggles for human rights, which I think are, I've observed are on the rise in recent years. In the 2000s, we're seeing a proliferation of locally grounded struggles with making rights claims at local and community levels that are also connected across locales. So translocal networking is really pronounced in this new wave of movement that David Harvey has talked about as rebel cities. So we're seeing something new and different in the past 20 years or so, and I'm reflecting on what this means. And I think a lot of what these struggles are arising from is kind of the nature of this political moment of systemic crisis of capitalism, and the fact that more and more people are increasingly engaged in not a struggle over the means of production, as we've come to think in Marxist terms, but really a struggle over the means of survival. And so this is part of our political moment. And then the talk this morning got me thinking about that idea of control. And are we really working to control the means of survival? Or does this idea of decolonizing better fit what our struggles are about? Are we really trying to change the ideas of ownership and really transform our relationship to place and to the land? And I think that's maybe something we can think about a little more as we engage in the next day over of these ideas. But I think that idea of decolonizing is a good one for us to think about, and what this means in terms of this struggle for survival that so many folks are engaged in. Another lesson that I think is becoming clear is that at its core, what capitalism is about is a process of what author Mindy Fullilove calls serial forced displacement. Serial forced displacement. And Fullilove uses the term in regard to her study of urban housing and redevelopment policies and the displacement of African American communities. But I think that idea applies throughout the history of capitalism. It's always been about displacing people from the land and from their communities. And so we can think about what that means in terms of these localized struggles today. So if that's what capitalism is about, then our struggles should really be about connecting people to place and the land, and reestablishing those connections, and also connecting people with each other. Capitalism has really worked to divide people across race, gender, class. And so our movements really, at their core, should be about this process of reconnecting. And author George Monbiot uses the idea of politics of belonging as to kind of capture what this moment should be about for the movements on the left. And that seems to resonate with the work I'm doing. So the Right to the Cities movement that I'm going to talk about, I think, is an example of a decolonizing project that's emergent at our particular moment in history. And like I said, these localized struggles around rights-based claims are a phenomenon that seems to be on the rise, and starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, really starting in the global South around some of the slum dwellers' struggles to gain control and access to their to basic livelihood in large cities, rapidly growing cities in the global South. And these movements spread in part through the World Social Forum process. And you saw in that process the rise of discourse around the right to the city. At the same time in Europe, the process of European Union integration was generating rights-based resistance as well. And the idea that people weren't just about commerce, that governance also needed to keep in mind the social dimensions of societies. And so these different discourses around rights and commitment to place were emerging at this time. And at the same time, you had another strand connected in part through the UN, United Nations process of creating formal human rights cities. And these cities have been expanding since the late 1990s. The city of Rosario, Argentina was the very first formal human rights city that was formed in 1997. Since then, dozens of cities have grown around this idea of taking the human rights principles that are articulated in international law and trying to translate them into local contexts in various ways. So these human rights cities or right to the cities projects are really about redesigning cities around human needs rather than commerce. And as you can imagine, if you think about it, many cities really have been designed, especially under neoliberalism, have been designed and oriented around the needs of capital. As Logan and Malich talk about it, cities have been organized to prioritize exchange value over use value. So the needs of capital over the needs of residents who use cities as places to work and live. So, so human rights cities are about flipping that around and saying cities need to be organized to prioritize human rights and not economic growth or the needs of business. So they're really projects that are about engaging people's political imaginations, political and legal imaginations, expanding beyond the confines of electoral politics and really being creative about thinking about what would it mean to have human rights in their entirety be the organizing principles of governance. Other scholars have referred to this idea as international law from below. So getting regular folks, not just lawyers, involved in thinking about what kinds of laws and guidelines do we need in order to achieve these principles that are deemed to be universal. And when you actually talk with people, most people want human rights, at least for themselves. So it's an interesting conversation in communities when we have them read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and really think about these questions of, so how do we get these? International law from below. And like I said, these human rights cities projects, by emphasizing place, they really kind of counter the logic of capitalism, which is about disconnecting people from place. And so, in a sense, it's a very radical project that goes directly counters the hegemonic logic of capital that says place doesn't matter. But it's different from the nationalist and ethnic kinds of struggles that are tied to places in the sense that there's a very, very deliberate and active connecting across place. So it's not like the NIMBY, not in my backyard movements. It's, there's the folks I've worked with in this movement are constantly looking to make connections and share ideas across cities. So it's translocal in that sense. The idea of human rights that's embedded in these movements is different from the legalistic notions that many scholars especially bring to human rights. And the activists I work with talk about it as people-centered human rights. And what that means is based in the experiences of regular folks and really centering the needs and voices of those who've been most neglected or suffer the most human rights abuses. And by centering those whose rights have been most violated, we ensure that everyone's rights are respected. So the people-centered human rights language comes out of the U.S. Human Rights Network, and when you read their thinking, it's very, very explicitly decolonial in its conceptions. So by bringing human rights language into local political discussions, another thing that we're doing with human rights cities is changing the political script. really flipping them around to say, in the words of the slogan that we use in Pittsburgh, human rights don't trickle down, they rise up. So, you know, politicians like to say, well, if we have economic growth, then everybody will have jobs and benefit from the tax base. And we say, no, there's not much evidence for that. Why don't we just put human rights first and see where we get with that? And then finally, I think a key task that we have in human rights cities is to cultivate human rights constituencies. So in the literature on cities, you see a lot of discussion about these urban growth coalitions. So coalitions of elected officials at the local level and business leaders and real estate developers who basically plan out urban developments without much communication with the larger public. And that's really how a lot of cities have been developed in recent years. So what human rights cities do is to try to build a constituency that calls politicians to account for human rights and shows that, hey, it's not just these business leaders who get to design our cities. And but what's interesting though is that when you think about the way civil society gets organized in the U.S., it's around different issues. So we have environmentalists and women's groups and education activists and anti-racist groups, and it goes on and on. But these groups don't work together around a unified front. So what we do in the Human Rights Cities project is to try to get folks to think about their struggles in common terms, and then to work to fight together for a common agenda that's really unified around human rights, so that politicians need to pay more attention to us. We're a bigger force. But that idea of a human rights constituency, I think, is really, really critical to thinking about how large-scale social change can happen and really redirect public policies in a way that can move us away from a capitalist orientation towards a human-centered and environmental-centered kinds of policies and practices. So those are some of the kinds of basic ideas and orientations and strategies that orient our human rights cities. But I think what's going to be most helpful for you is to see how we do it in a particular place. And I happen to know a lot about that because I'm always constantly organizing something as part of our Pittsburgh's Human Rights City Alliance. And I'll show you that website to give you a sense. And that's pghrights.org if you want to go there. And it's not fancy, but it works. And there's a lot of documentation about our work because I'm a sociologist. And one thing I did learn is that when we started this project in Pittsburgh, I thought, well, we'll learn what other cities have done because there's a dozen that I knew about already. And I found that there was very little documentation. Activists don't really do a very good job of documenting for good reason, but scholars hadn't paid much attention to this movement yet, although that's changing. And we in Pittsburgh helped get a Wikipedia page going, so I will encourage you all to visit that and help us strengthen that too. But I'll tell you the story about Pittsburgh and our Human Rights City project, and that really started in 2011, and started before I got to Pittsburgh. A youth group that was affiliated with the American Friends Service Committee, which is one of the organizations that have been important in the World Social Forum process and bringing U.S. grassroots groups to the World Social Forum. So the idea has kind of flowed through these global channels. And this youth group got a city kind of, they borrowed language from the Washington, D.C. Initiative. Washington, D.C. was the first human rights city in the United States in 2008. And so these students learned about that and brought it to Pittsburgh and asked the city council to pass a resolution on making Pittsburgh a human rights city, which of course they did, because why would they oppose this little youth group initiative that sounded like principles that everyone would support. And so this got passed, but the young people graduated and moved on, and they thought that their public officials would do their diligence and carry out this proclamation that they signed. And so we all know that that doesn't happen. And so when I moved there and I learned that Pittsburgh had this, I had already been working around this idea with a previous community. So I said, well, let's build a coalition to really push this forward. And we had an opportunity to really mobilize around that when one of the city council members that signed the proclamation got elected mayor. So we used that to start mobilizing a broader alliance in 2013. So we started in late 2013. And I'll give you a few examples of some of the things that we've done to try to carry out these principles and do what we thought of as the work of trying to translate human rights into our city and to engage more of our residents in this work. So one of the things that happened early in our time was Seattle, the city of Seattle, which is also a human rights city, passed a resolution to declare October 12th Indigenous Peoples Day. And so our group was meeting and thought that's a really important thing to do, because to be a human rights city, you have to start with basic principles and that truth telling about history. And so we thought, well, this is a good political moment for us to try to copy Seattle and copy Seattle's example and bring it to Pittsburgh. So we got the city council to pass it was called the Will of Council. So a little stronger than a proclamation to declare October 12th Indigenous Peoples Day in Pittsburgh. And that was really easy. But of course, nothing really comes of it unless we do something. But it has been really useful to have that to point to and tell people that Pittsburgh did this, and then to encourage residents to take some action. And I usually try to get people at the university to organize events around Indigenous Peoples Day, and even in the Human Rights City Alliance among some of the activists. One thing we did this year to try to recognize the day is we selected a book written by a Native American and created a discussion guide that we put on our website. It's still there. It's really a good discussion guide, and just encourage people to organize coffee shop book discussions or just book discussions with their friends. So we kind of decentralized some of that work of what's called by some of the organizers human rights learning. So giving people a chance to reflect on the experiences of groups that have been marginalized or erased from our history, and to engage in public learning and conversations about what that means, and really doing that important work for human rights that is historical truth telling. Another dimension of this that we're doing more on both in Pittsburgh and at the national level is around the International Decade on People of African Descent. And I want to lift that up for you scholar activists, because that's, how many people have heard about the International Decade of People of African Descent? just one person. So we all need to know about it. We all need to make sure everybody else knows about it. 2015 to 2025 is the decade. And so one of the things we do is try to lift up that important kind of, that's a UN designation. And there's a great website that the UN has. And my colleagues and I in the National Human Rights Cities Alliance are working to do more to provide resources for local groups to take action that will help promote the decade. But now that you know, you can go online, there's some good resources. And that's another good teachable moment and space for human rights learning that we try to employ in the Human Rights City Alliance. Another really exciting example from Pittsburgh and other cities is regarding the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And as you probably know, the United States is one of about 5 countries that has not ratified the CEDAW Convention. And so a few years ago, feminist groups came together and formed the Cities for CEDAW Alliance. It's a national group that's saying, we're not going to wait for Washington to ratify this treaty. We're going to just start implementing it in our communities. And so last year, 2016, December 2016, Pittsburgh became the 6th CEDAW city in the United States. And I hope you'll all go home and start working on that. And just yesterday, we had a press conference to launch the new Gender Equity Commission. That's now in the city. It's in the mayor's office. And the new commissioner is somebody who came out of our movement. And she's institutionalizing this position. And I was just in her office talking with her about some of the ideas that she needs to bring there. One of them being one of our current campaigns, one of our allies, Pittsburghers for Public Transit, is fighting an initiative that would basically build a busway between downtown and a part of town that would really just serve the needs of choice riders, of higher income workers. And then it would come at the cost of bus riders or transit users who are further out and more dependent on transit. And so we're fighting a really important campaign there. And so I was suggesting that we needed to show the gender dimensions of these transit cuts. And given it doesn't take very long to think about all of those gender dimensions, especially given that something like 3/4 of low-income families are headed by women. So this Gender Equity Commission, which is funded by the city government as part of the efforts of this coalition, which said we didn't just want an ordinance to implement the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We really wanted it to have teeth. And so now we have a Gender Equity Commission. Now, all of this work is really based on learning from the city of San Francisco, which passed a CEDAW ordinance, I think in 1999, maybe. So it was one of the first cities to do this. So, but I think the Cities for CEDAW initiative has been a really excellent one, an excellent example of this international law from below. And one of the things that it did for us in Pittsburgh is it helped expand people's legal imaginations. And I found that after this campaign, it was much easier to talk to people about the Human Rights City project because they could wrap their minds around what it could mean to take international law and try to implement it in our city. Because for many people, international law and the United Nations are really abstract and far away, but this made it more real for them. Incidentally, another thing that made it more real for them and that made it easier for us to talk about this very strange model of political activism that even lefties really had a hard time hearing what we were trying to say. The Trump election. I think after that election, people realized, well, Washington's not going to be very helpful as a target, and we need to defend our basic rights. They're happening right, being violated right here, and so that's been a really kind of important strategic lesson that it's an unfortunate one, but it has helped people imagine new ways of doing politics. And it really reflects what in the transnational movements literature is called the boomerang effect. Has people read Catherine Sinking's work on this? So the lesson from human rights struggles around the world has been that some of the successful human rights movements have organized and built alliances outside of their countries so that they could appeal to international law, international authorities, or to other countries and put pressure back on their states. So that's the boomerang. And I think we're at a point now in this country where we need to do just that. We have an authoritarian oriented national government, and our international allies can be resources for our movement. But many activists and residents of the United States aren't used to thinking that we might need people from outside this country. But that's where our work in expanding the political and legal imaginations can really help us bring more resources and energy into our movements. So another example that I want to lift up here is a thing that we do in Pittsburgh that I think is another good idea for other cities is we have a summit against racism that happens every year. And it was founded 20 years ago now, after one of those familiar killings of a young African-American man by the police. And the community response was to convene a summit against racism to bring community members together and to figure out how we can organize against racism. This year, there were 700 people participating in our Summit Against Racism. So it's a very significant event in the city, and it really does bring together a large and diverse range of activists. But what's kind of surprising is that the panels that our group, the Human Rights City Alliance, organizes are among the few that really help people come together and strategize about how do we build coalitions around human rights. So getting out of the silos and thinking strategically about how we can engage in different kinds of politics. And so we've organized panels every year since 2014 or 2014 would be the first year. And these have been good at helping us reach a bigger audience and getting people to think about these ideas and learn about what human rights cities are and what they might do. I'll jump to some recent examples. Just a few weeks ago, so Pittsburgh is one of the cities that's trying to become the next headquarters of Amazon, and we're trying not to be. But there's been, as in many of these cities, there's been very little critical reflection and discourse around what the impacts of that development would be. So we wanted to create a forum, a community forum, where we could shed light on some of those the implications of an Amazon headquarters for housing, infrastructure, and other things that are priorities for residents in the city. And that's probably not going to help us in terms of our relationship with the mayor, who's very much hoping that he can bring Amazon to Pittsburgh. But we had really great turnout, again, a really diverse audience, so we were able to get people out of the silos and to expand people's thinking. And a lot of people who came to the forum weren't really sure what to think about it, about the Amazon thing. And there is a lot of cheerleading in the news media. And so we were able to bring, actually the panel was all women and people of color. And so it was able to bring the voices that were left out of the public discussion that had been presented in the media and by public officials. So, and I've been in the middle of planning the follow-up to that. And we're looking at the technology economy and its implications for equity and for the residents of our city. So the idea is that the ways that corporate-oriented development happen displace people from the city, and really it's a form of disappearance. And so we've prioritized that, these struggles because that's probably the most serious human rights violation is eliminating people from our place. So continuing on that theme, another activity that we did that again is on the website if you want to learn more about that. A year ago, last fall, we organized a housing summit, affordable housing summit. In Pittsburgh, like many cities, many big cities, has a serious affordable housing deficit. The estimates there are about 17,000 units deficit of affordable housing. Like many cities, they've been tearing down public housing and replacing it with privatized housing that people have to apply for vouchers to get, and those vouchers are increasingly difficult to use because landlords don't have to accept them. So the Housing Summit was a space, and again, it was one of the few spaces in the city, even though we're talking a lot about affordable housing in the city, even in the activist spaces that I've been in, and I was part of a left coalition of groups working to defend some of the remaining public housing. Even in those spaces, the conversation gets bogged down around the market kinds of logic. So how are we going to make sure that the new developments have so many units of affordable housing? And it's always around markets. And so we built this housing summit, and working with community leaders on housing and university faculty and students were part of organizing this. And we decided we're going to have a focus here on the human right to housing and help people learn about the international precedents that are there for the human right to housing, and really try to shift the discourse and say, what does it mean to have a human right to housing, and how is it different from this market orientation that we have? And the final example that I want to lift up, because I will refer back to this, is an initiative that I just started this year that I'm calling the PIT, University of Pittsburgh, we're called PIT Human Rights Initiative. And that grew out of the Housing Summit experience, where we were working with a steering committee of community leaders and faculty from the university. And I wanted to build a permanent steering committee of faculty members from different departments and programs around campus, and connect them with community leaders who would help shape the agenda for our group. And what we're doing is, we helped plan the Amazon forums. So that was one of the activities, our first activity. We're going to host speakers, apply for grants that will allow us to expand conversations and research around human rights, and be a way to connect community groups with faculty members and students and classes, so that we can better integrate the university with the community. And so that's a project that has come out of this work of really, as I often say with my co-organizers, we're making the path as we walk, figuring this out as we go. We don't really know what it means to be a human rights city because we haven't seen one, but we know kind of what the next step might be, or what opportunity presents us with possibilities of reaching a bigger audience or deepening people's knowledge and understanding of human rights, or maybe transforming some of our local government structures and thinking. So I want to leave time for discussion before people get too tired, but I'm going to shift to some talk about our roles as activist scholars. And I found that in these human rights cities, there's a lot of us, interestingly enough. And I tried to figure out why this was the case. That almost every city that I've come to know to any degree, I can see that there's an activist scholar has played some kind of catalyst role. Some of these folks are lawyers, so that kind of makes sense. Lawyers trying to figure out how to make the law really work for people. And they're fun to work with. And some are like me, kind of sociologists trying to think about how do we change institutions so they work for people. But what scholar activists are doing in these movements, I think, are important. And there's a particular set of activities and skills that we have and that we bring to this movement, and that I think probably reflect what we do in other movements. And these skills are unique to our profession. We're trained to do these things, and movements that don't have our participation don't have these kinds of skills that are critical for most movements. So what we end up doing is helping with bridge building and networking. So helping connect groups that don't usually talk with one another. And virtually every one of our activities, I see that happening. And we're used to communicating with students, with people who are different from ourselves. We learn about how that works, and so that bridge building and networking are things that we are uniquely situated to help do. Also, our status and our position at universities gives us entree and access to people who wouldn't otherwise have any reason to answer our emails. So that bridge building and networking skill. Translation is another thing that scholar activists are doing in these movements, both helping translate across groups as part of this bridge building, translating ideas of human rights into the language that activists are already thinking. So how does your issue, how do human rights help you address your priority issue? Translating the global to the local. So both helping people know about the CEDAW Convention, for instance, and how it's helped people in other countries, but also helping people know about movements outside the United States. And I find that if you all probably have some experience with this, when you tell people about what folks in Argentina or Brazil are doing, they feel like, oh, cool, we're not alone. And we've got a movement. So helping people see these dimensions of activism that they don't otherwise, they're not conscious of. So translation. The third role that we play is synthesis and documentation. So I told you we had to build the Wikipedia page and start documenting this movement, but also not just taking notes at meetings, but helping to draw out what are some of the themes and lessons that are emerging in a group's conversation over time, and helping groups remember decisions that were made in prior periods. So we have the skills to do that, and often we have more time to do that than activists have. And I find myself doing these roles in this work. Communication. Interestingly, when I'm in a lot of the coalition organizing spaces, when we break up into working groups, the communication working group is one of the smaller ones. Even though, and if you think about what movements do, it seems like the communication working group would be one of the big ones. But it's not a skill that's widely available to most people, or that most people have confidence in. So, but scholars, that's what we do. We're trained to do that, and so communication is a key thing that we can contribute to movements. But what happens in our profession, we're organized out of social movements. We're taught to keep a distance, to put on a lab coat, to not be engaged in movements, just to study them and often just to critique them and to figure out why they don't work. So that's why I'll lift up a quote that was raised earlier today by Gustavo Esteva, and this identity of a deprofessionalized intellectuals, I think is a really fruitful way to think about our work. But we have to think about what that deprofessionalization means, because we do sit in a privileged space, and in many ways we can use that privileged position to help social movements. So so my last point is that what's emerging from this work is this idea that decolonizing cities means that we have to decolonize universities. And I'm increasingly thinking about the university industrial complex. And in cities, you hear about the eds and meds and tech economy. Our universities are complicit in this work of displacing residents from cities. And my university is right up there. So we have to organize, really, if we're going to be a human rights city, we have to take on our university. So the university has to let workers organize, and it has to stop displacing residents. And we can go on and on. But even starting that, engaging my colleagues in that question is an important step in this human rights city process. And it's something we've learned through this work. Okay. Yeah, just one more idea. I'm going to go and talk about what we can do to help make it more possible for more of us to contribute to the movements in the ways that we're seeing are needed. And one of the groups that I've helped organize and am looking for more help with is the International Network of Scholar Activists. And that's scholaractivist.org is the website if you want to check it out. And that also came out of the World Social Forum process through conversations that many activist scholars and we found ourselves meeting in lots of different places and having workshops on how schizophrenic our lives were, because we were trying to be scholars and activists and get tenure and all that. And we met in the 2005 Social Forum and had a series of workshops that really allowed us to kind of crystallize some of the collective wisdom from this global conversation among scholars. And we identified 3 areas of work that we needed to do as scholars. And we were sitting in the World Social Forum spaces and thinking about how can we contribute to this really important process. So the first thing that we lifted up is that we need to be engaged in resisting capitalism on our campuses. And that's a front line of struggle that only we can play. But we need to play it because our success there is going to impact everybody else in the rest of our movements. So fighting neoliberalism, fighting capitalism on our campuses, and keeping universities as free spaces that are part of the community and accessible to the community is really a struggle that we've neglected. And the result is student debt, lack of access to our institutions, and the corporate university. The second area of work that's really critical for us and that we have to play a leading role is defending the knowledge commons. And Key pieces of that are the open access movement. So you saw the Journal of World Systems Research is one example. The open access movement is really exciting. It's growing very quickly now, and there's you can check out your library may even have resources to help support open access publishing. Open access, free and open source software is another thing that we can push on our campuses. Probably all of your campuses mostly provide Mac and Windows support. Call up your IT office and see if they'll put Linux on your machines and see what kind of answer you get. But we have to be making sure that our universities teach our students about and make our students aware of and have them have access to free and open source software, because they're going to need it in the economy that they're going out into. When they don't have the software that the university provides them with, they're going to need alternatives to corporate software. And finally, the third part of the International Network of Scholar Activists is supporting transformative social movements. So doing the work of being engaged in this movement, and being a network and being a collective of scholars, activists. What we can do is maintain relationships with social movements that it's hard for individual scholars to have, but those relationships are really key. And so one thing that we have been able to do is when the climate negotiations happened in, where was the last one, in Paris? I helped pull together folks in the network who were studying that or bringing groups of students there, and we connected them with one of the leading grassroots environmental justice groups that was going to be there, so that the students could help interview those activists and get their story out, and otherwise support that initiative. So it's hard for individual scholars to maintain relationships with activist groups, but as a network, we can and do have relationships with a lot of the groups that were part of the U.S. Social Forum process and the World Social Forum process, and so we can provide access or entree for researchers and students who are working on these struggles. So I'm going to end there and encourage you all to think of joining or creating a campus chapter of INOSA. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking. That's fine.
Okay, folks, do you have any questions for Dr. Smith? Please, not everyone at once.
Just to get people going, this is not really a question. I just want to say I really appreciate the very practical advice that you gave us, and also the work that you're doing in Pittsburgh. I witnessed a radical change in East Liberty when I was in Pittsburgh, luxury houses, and when Google came to Bakery Square,
Yeah.
the gentrification was horrific, really. And like the neighboring city of Wilkinsburg, or like neighboring, I don't know, neighborhood or whatever you want to call it, they really need help. Police brutality, everything is just so hard, and I'm really appreciative of your work, and hopefully we can learn from you and make Santa Barbara a better place. We are dealing with a lot of homeless people here and a lot of people in need. Yeah. So no question, but thank you.
Check out the Wikipedia page for the human rights cities, because there's some other cities in California that are human rights cities, and many of them are inspired by the housing crisis. Eugene, Oregon also has some good practical policies around homelessness and housing.
Thank you. Actually, I think I have two questions maybe. One is, I guess, with the Human Rights City, how is that network articulated with or working with the Sanctuary City and Solidarity City movements? Or I assume that they're quite similar in a lot of respects. I'm curious, yeah, how that works together. And then the other question, I really appreciated your call for us to pay attention to the way that capitalism operates in the university and the university as a force of displacement. And I've been involved in housing organizing at UCLA, and I know that here, also last year, I think students organized to successfully defeat a rent hike at university housing here. So that's very exciting. And we at UCLA also are facing rent hikes every year in our student housing, which are obviously not affordable. You think that they would be, and they would pay attention to affordability metrics about what our community can actually afford. But as you mentioned, the market logics just really rule the conversation coming from the university, right? Their logic is that because our rents are 10 to 30% below the surrounding markets rate of housing, that then it's affordable. Obviously, it is not. So I guess I was wondering also, if your work at University of Pittsburgh, if you have some suggestions of strategies or ways that you've been able to intervene into, how to decenter that conversation from, the market logics.
Good. The Sanctuary City, we have tried to use that as a kind of teachable moment or an organizing opportunity, because people get that we need to defend rights in our communities, and that there's very practical things we can do. So we have tried to, organize with, we have relationships with immigrant rights groups in the city. So trying to build on that, and hopefully, like the CEDA initiative, hopefully that logic, I think can be extended. And I think there's a presentation earlier about the Berlin Solidarity City idea. And I think that reflects kind of a similar idea of expanding. We're not just trying to keep authorities from removing people, but we want to make sure that their whole range of rights are protected. So kind of expanding that political and legal imagination. But it's not an automatic thing, because everybody's really super busy, and one response is, I'm just going to work on this issue. And don't make me think too hard about how other things connect. That's the experience I have talking with a lot of people. But I am finding that over the years, so we started in 2013, and over the years, we're getting more traction. People are starting to get what we're talking about. And so you just got to keep saying it. And now we have our Gender Equity Commission. And I was in her office just the other day, and every time somebody came by, she made sure to point out that I was part of this Human Rights City Alliance, and she was talking about how she's been using language of human rights in her communications within the city government. So we've got to really be creative about how we see these conversations and expand people's thinking and help them see what these connections are. But then there can be exponential kinds of growth with that. So housing, this is a really interesting project. And again, I think we just have to keep using the language of rights. But what's really helpful is for us as activist scholars is to tell people what's going on internationally. And there is a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. And there's been these really amazing reports that the UN has put out on US human rights practices. And they're really useful for us to use. And very recently, there was the special rapporteur on extreme poverty was here, actually in California, I think. And his report is damning. But nobody, it's not being talked about in the mainstream media, and many residents don't know that anybody cares about their suffering. But when they hear that somebody in Geneva has come to the US and written this report, and they're talking about it internationally, and they're calling the US delegate to hear the critique. Yeah, I mean, the US government doesn't want to be called out on this stuff in public. They certainly don't want people to know about it. So what we should be doing is making sure that people know about it. So if you go to, actually the US Human Rights Network is a great website to find these reports on all of the UN, all the reviews of US practices in the UN human rights bodies. And the US has signed, one of the treaties we have signed, surprisingly, is the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. CERD, it's called. And there's a review process that's built into that, and the US government has to tell the UN what it has done to implement the treaty, and then the UN officials look at that report, and they also listen to civil society. There's a shadow report that human rights groups in this country bring, and there's an official report. It's a really good organizing tool for us. And I find that when I talk with people in Pittsburgh about this, it doesn't take long to explain this international process. It's not that complicated. They really get inspired just to know that somebody outside the US cares about the experience that they have in Pittsburgh. It's not just something they're suffering in silence, but there is attention to it. So we need to use those documents better. But in Pittsburgh and elsewhere, the US Right to the City Alliance is organizing around the idea of renters unions or tenants unions. And that's what we're trying to do in Pittsburgh is bring people together. Most of the organizing so far is building by building, and it's defensive. They wait until they're getting kicked out to really get organized. So we want to be citywide or even countywide, and really build some solidarity across different classes of renters. So that might be something. And the Homes for All is the campaign, and there's some resources around tenant organizing. But I think students are ripe for organizing around this model, and there's been a lot of energy, I know, in Pittsburgh among students.
Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned the community effects. Could you tell me a bit more about it and how it could possibly work with the US and how it could go possibly?
Okay, I'm going to refer back to the example I just gave of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So one of the review process for that treaty, I think, is coming up. I think we're actually late in submitting, the US government is late in submitting that report. But what happens then is civil society groups and the US Human Rights Network helps. If you go to their website, there's a form that you can download, and it shows what to assemble to compile local information about that's relevant to that treaty and the obligations that the United States has. So then this information gets brought to Geneva, and it then brings international pressure back on the US government. But again, that pressure doesn't really matter unless residents know that there is this report and try to hold residents or hold government officials accountable. But also, I think what's another way that the boomerang effect can happen, and what may be really more important in this political moment, is for people outside the United States, and I know a lot of activists outside the United States, when they've come and seen some of our work, they're very inspired, because they really, from that outside, they can't see our opposition to Trump. And so there's a sense that, wow, the American public isn't doing anything, they're not resisting. So to really build connections and make sure that allies outside the United States know what's happening here and know that there is resistance can provide some avenues for appealing to U.S. allies. There's a lot of human rights city allies and networks in Europe who could be resources for bringing pressure onto the U.S. government that could be really meaningful in terms of imposing costs. But I think, building a global human rights culture is something that's going to take us networking laterally, but also trying to shape the discourses of, if we can't shape our own governments here, we can try to shape the discourses in the international community and lift up human rights that way. But the U.S. isn't alone in really neglecting human rights. No government has really been a champion of human rights. All of the history says that we only get human rights when people organize to demand them and to make noise about them. So this idea of thinking outside this state, we've got to be creative about our politics. And so many folks in this country really see politics as contained within this electoral process and certainly contained within our state. But if we situate ourselves in this global context, we can see many more possibilities for bringing pressure around human rights. Does that help?
I have a few questions.
You're entitled after all the organizing you can.
I was rather intrigued by what you said about the folks with whom you work and yourself making the path as you walk. I think that statement certainly points to how you learn as you go and apply what you learn to what you do. But I'm also curious about the perhaps innately figurative nature of the work that you do. I'm basically curious as to how your everyday politics shape the path that you walk in what is prefigurative about your everyday human rights practices, if you will.
That's a tough one. Yeah, I'm not sure at this time of the year, I'm not sure exactly how to respond, but I think one of the kind of founders of the Human Rights City project is Shulamit Koenig, who's a Holocaust survivor, lives in New York, and is a tireless advocate for human rights. And she insists that really the key for human rights cities is human rights learning and building a human rights culture. And I think really that captures this idea that we have to really implement these principles in our communities. And the work of human rights cities, as you've probably gathered from my examples, it encompasses a lot of different dimensions of politics. And what's exciting too is that it can create a lot of different ways that people can participate. Because you can think of a lot of different kinds of projects, so the reading groups. We haven't gotten into the schools very much yet, but I thought of ways that we could engage students in essay contests or art contests around the Universal Declaration. But cultural work is really critical for human rights learning and changing people's thinking and consciousness and their sense of identity and place. And that's another thing that's interesting in this work too, is really being conscious of the really rebuilding people's identity around place. Because they have been disconnected and people don't know their neighbors, and actually helping them meet their neighbors, especially neighbors that are very different from them, is really an important and radical project. What this Human Rights City project does is it really expands the canvas of our politics, and it creates a lot of different openings for more people to be part of that. But we can help make people more conscious of this work as a political project of decolonization. And I didn't make up the making the path as we walk phrase. You've probably heard it or felt it if you've done movement work. It's just part of the struggle.
Yeah, it has been a long day.
I will be here all day tomorrow.
Yeah,
and
I'm like, oh, people please have questions, but I didn't, like my brain personally can receive but cannot produce right now.
So, everybody sleep on it. And I like to share our lessons because, I'm just presenting what kind of worked. And it's not like everybody in Pittsburgh knows that we're a human rights city, and very few people do. So if you go and ask somebody on the street, they won't know it. So we haven't really been all that effective. But I think as a movement strategy and idea, we've generated some lessons that I think are really promising, and I do feel that we're building. So I'm happy to share on the Human Rights City, but also if folks are interested in the Scholar Activist Network and maybe starting a chapter here, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But hopefully you jotted down the website, and I'm looking forward to another day with you all. So thanks for listening and staying awake.
Should we end this?